because I'm always looking at, okay, what is it that we're dealing with here? What is it that we're talking about here in terms of the experience, the possible experience? And one way to talk about that is to talk about being, being, the verb being, right? Because one of the things that can be recognized is that what we are is being, what we are is happening, what we are is dynamic. It's a verb. It's not static. It's not a thing. It doesn't have a position. The Heart Sutra says emptiness is form and form is emptiness. So what never changes is always changing. What never changes is always changing. The thing about it that stays the same is change. Both things are true. I mean, this is the truth. The truth is beyond the opposites, right? It's beyond the opposites, right? So when I talk about being, and I say that being is a verb, being isn't a thing. One way that I think is helpful is that we are so attached and conditioned to our way of being as a human being that we automatically relate to the idea of awareness is that I am aware. I am being aware. I am being aware. I am being. Now, the way it usually is manifest is human being. In other words, you're a human first and then you be. You're a human first and then you're being. But in reality, you're being human. You were a being before you became human. Human in the way that I mean it is that you get conditioned into the identity of being a body and a person and all the rest of it, right? But being was there before human. So the more accurate way of describing what's true is being human. My dog, for example, is not being a dog. Right? My dog is not being a dog. Right? The dog is just being. It just is. One of the things about it that I mentioned the other day is that, Ramana Maharshi commonly spoke to people by asking them a question. When they asked the question, he would commonly ask them, who is it that's asking this question? But a more accurate way, and David Hawkins pointed this out, is to say, what is asking this question? Because if you say, who is asking this question, you're still relating to the idea that there is a pronoun, there is a person. Who are you being? It's not a... So that's one of the things that I think is helpful in terms of our... in terms of our distinguishing the reality of awareness is to recognize that awareness is not human. Awareness is, like Mooji says, isness. It's closer to what it is to relate to it as it's just isness. It can be human, right? So if you distinguish being, one of the ways that you can practice meditation is to see if you can simply be, and that being that you're being is not being anything. It's just being, right? But in the normal course of events, the way we're conditioned and the way we operate is we're always being something, right? We're being happy, we're being sad, we're being depressed, we're being a body, we're being a person, we're being a father. or being a businessman. So there's an identity reality that's involved that is always happening. It's the way Paul Hederman talks about the way that this identity factor claims everything that appears before it. So it's not a body, it's my body. It's not a life, it's my life. We identify with everything. And so one way to get free, one way of deconstructing that construction is to recognize that it is not human. Of course, obviously, it's also incomprehensible, so we're still talking about it in dualistic terms. We're still talking about it in a way that we're making it conceptual so that we can deal with it. But it can't be dealt with, and it isn't conceptual. So even when we talk about that, you can move from the idea that it's an identity to it's not an identity. It's the possibility of identity. It's not a manifest form. It's the possibility of a manifest form. If you want to talk about it in terms of quantum mechanics, probably the closest way you could talk about it is to talk about it as a subatomic particle, right? If my understanding is correct, a subatomic particle has no particular form yet. It's got potentials, right? It's got the potential to take form, but it is not yet taken form. Being is like that. Being is like that. And since being is the truth, being is what we are, the possibility is to experience being, to experience just being, as distinct from being a body, as distinct from being a person, as distinct from being a father, a mother, a role, as distinct from being anything, but simply just being. And of course, that is also a concept, so it's pointing to something. It's not the thing itself. It's pointing to this possibility of being, this possibility that's just like space. And it's been my experience that it is possible to experience being, just being, as it relates to any situation that you may find yourself in. It's possible through practicing meditation to experience just being. And it's been my experience that when you experience just being, and of course when I say when you experience just being, what I'm saying is when being experiences just being, there is this excitement, there is this aliveness about it that exists on its own, that exists not dependent upon whatever is going on. And so, one of the ways that I look at this is when I consider somebody like Ramana Maharshi. He, I think, is a good example of somebody who spent a lot of his time simply being. If you learn about him, he spent his life just being. In fact, in the early part of his life, when he was sitting in meditation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for many, many months, to the point where people had to take care of him, where at one point he was meditating in the basement of a temple to get away from the kids that were throwing stones at him. And he was sitting in this little dark place in the basement. And he was so absorbed in being that there were insects eating his body, and he had open sores. And his body was actually dying. And fortunately, somebody found him, and they took him out of there and had him started to take care of him. But even after that, when he was in the ashram, His life was a life of being. If you look at the pictures of him sitting in the hall where he sat every day, he would get up and he would sit in the hall, and people would come and sit with him in the hall. Sometimes he would talk, sometimes he would. In the beginning, he didn't talk at all. He would just sit there. And then he would take a walk on the mountain. His Arunachala was the mountain that he considered to be the manifestation of God itself. So he would take a walk, but then he would come back and he would just go back to the hall and sit. And if you look at the pictures of him sitting, there is this, if you can get it, if you can see it, there is this look in his eyes of that this look of, it's hard to describe, it's just like being, is all I can say. It's like he's just being there. And in one film clip that I saw of him, he was sitting in the hall, and he was in that absorbed state of just beingness. And you could see his head like kind of bobbing and moving. And he didn't have Parkinson's or anything like that, but the strength of the chi, the strength of the life force in his body was so strong that his head would pulsate when he was just sitting still. And a lot of people in the beginning who went and sat with him before he began to speak reported that just being in his presence and making contact with his eyes and this state of being kind of tuned them into that state, like a tuning fork, like the vibration would align them into that vibration, and they would come into this state of bliss and this experience of being. So what I'm suggesting to you is that there is this possibility of distinguishing being as separate from everything else, as an experience of just being that becomes distinct enough for you that no matter what's going on, you may be being, even when you're being happy or sad, or you're being in a role that you're playing, that the being is distinct. It's a distinct experience that you're having. And this is when they talk about happiness, the happiness that's available. It's the happiness of being. So that you could be sad, you could be angry, you could be depressed, you could be, involved in any of these ways, but it would not change the experience you were having of being, which is self-fulfilling. My cup runneth over, which is self-fulfilling, which is inherently satisfying, inherently free, inherently with the knowledge that whatever is going on was not affecting this pure state of being. So I'm sharing that with you as a possibility, that it's possible to distinguish this state of being and to see if you can consider the possibility, look at some of the stuff on YouTube of Ramana Maharshi. I mean, one of the reasons that he was considered to be different from most other teachers was that he did nothing in his life but be. All the other teachers, Nisargadatta, Papaji, all the other teachers had done other things in their life. Nisargadatta was a tobacco salesman. He had a family, wife and children and so forth and so on, and so did Papaji, and so did most other teachers. But this man was distinct in the sense that he had none of that. His whole life was absolutely committed to simply being. And so that's why I think he is worthwhile to check out and to look at. In fact, his mother, she went to him after he had left his family and moved to Terravanamale, because he had this vision of this place as being a holy place that he felt compelled to go to. And after he had gone there and he was meditating in the temples and so forth, at some point his mother went there to try and talk him into coming home. And in the end, he talked her into staying there with him for the rest of her life. And he said that when she died, that she was liberated, that she had reached a complete state of liberation. In fact, when she was in the process of dying, he sat next to her and he put one of his hands on her head and the other on her heart. And he said that the energetic heart is on the right side of the chest. And he said that by doing this, he was helping the identity to move from the head into the heart. And that this helped her to reach final liberation before the body died. In fact, he did the same thing with his favorite cow, that he claims that he had a direct relationship with the consciousness of this cow. And when this cow was dying, he did the same thing. He put the hand on the head and the hand on the heart of the cow to help the cow reach full liberation. In fact, this cow, he became so close to this cow that this cow had freedom to do whatever it wanted. It would walk into the meeting hall whenever it wanted and just walk up to him, and they would have some kind of interaction. See, most people, when they hear things like that, it's so easy to write off. You know what I mean? It's so easy to say, man, that's crazy. But if you really let go of your conditioning and open yourself up, and you see that all things are possible, these things are not so fantastic at all. Because you got to understand something. I'm glad you brought that up. You have to understand something. That what he said later when he did talk was that he didn't know what happened. It wasn't like he decided to do that. He didn't know what he had moved into a state of pure awareness, but he didn't know what happened to him. It was only later that he actually started to read some of the teachings, Buddhist teachings and Hindu teachings, that he had a way of interpreting what had happened to him. But one of the things that he said when he taught people is, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to go to a monastery. You don't have to wear any robes. You don't have to do any rituals. You don't have to change anything in order to realize the truth, in order to realize who you are. He was very adamant about that. You didn't have to be prepared for it either. He was very adamant about that. There are a lot of Buddhist teachings that say you do have to be prepared for it. You have to meditate for a number of years. You have to be able to mature spiritually to get to a place where you can understand the high teachings. He did not agree with any of that. He said there is no preparation necessary. And maybe that's one of the reasons why he was considered to be one of the greatest Indian saints, because of his very direct way of looking at this. And he's one of the people, he's probably maybe the most, the person that is referred to the most when it comes to self-inquiry. That's what they called his method of teaching, self-inquiry, asking, who am I? So I guess what I'm suggesting is that you check them out, right?